The story begins with the main character, Harold, who is happily returning from the village, hoping to see the new house he had just finished building. But when he arrived, he fell to his knees in despair as he saw his beloved home had been burned to ashes. That house was the only thing he cherished in this world, and now that it was destroyed, Harold began to wonder if he had any reason left to live. In that moment, nothing mattered to him anymore. He wondered what had happened and what had caused it. When he returned from work that day, the house was already on fire, so it was clear he couldn't have caused it. This made Harold wonder if a new arsonist had appeared in town, someone who had decided to burn his house down at random. If the arsonist had to burn something, Harold wished they had chosen another place. As he was walking away from his burned-out home, he happened to overhear a man talking about a magic sword that he had found in a treasure room deep within the middle floors of the labyrinth. Harold knew that the labyrinth was a place where people could earn a lot of money just by exploring and catching monsters. But this news didn't really excite him. He knew very well that he had no special skills to complete that labyrinth. Harold was just an ordinary 25-year-old man with nothing special about him, which was probably why he had always worked so hard. Soon after, Harold realized he was completely broke. Because if he had a lot of money, he wouldn't be this devastated that his house had burned down. Thinking about his finances, he decided to go to the bank to see how much he had left in savings. After a few minutes, he arrived at the town bank, and the teller informed him that he only had 150,000 rubes left, an amount equivalent to 1 month's salary from his manual labor job. Although Harold was very poor, he had always been a hard worker. Besides his main job, he also took on side jobs in his free time. He even spent time gathering wild vegetables and herbs from the mountains to sell as cooking ingredients. Harold had once saved up over 20 million rubes, but most of that money had gone into building the house that had just been burned down. He informed the bank teller that he wanted to withdraw all his remaining money, reasoning that since there wasn't much left, he might as well just spend it all. Harold's first instinct was to buy an expensive meal, but then he thought that gambling might be a better idea. He arrived in front of a building where a sign advertised a slave auction. Harold had heard people talk about the slave trade before, but it wasn't a common sight. As he was about to walk past the building, a merchant stopped him and asked if he was interested in joining the slave auction. Harold replied that he was too poor to afford a slave. He knew that slaves usually cost at least 2 million rubes, and he himself didn't look like a rich person, so he wondered why this merchant was even talking to him. The merchant explained that he had slaves with starting bids as low as 10,000 rubes, and if he was lucky, Harold might even get one for cheaper. Initially, slaves were sold at a reserve price, which meant they could take a loss if necessary. But that was part of the fun of an auction. In any case, the merchant said Harold could come in and watch the auction if he wanted. A moment later, Harold entered the auction hall and was surprised by the number of people attending the event. He found an empty seat, and luckily, it was the last one available. At that moment, Harold realized the reason the merchant had been so eager to invite him in was because he wanted the participants to feel more excited seeing a full house. Shortly after, the merchant appeared on stage announcing that he represented a slave auction group that collected all kinds of slaves from all over. He promised that there would be a slave to suit the taste of every esteemed guest present. The auction officially began after each slave was introduced. The person who raised their hand and made the highest bid would become the buyer. The auction began with the introduction of a forest beauty, known as an elf. Upon seeing her, all the bidders immediately jumped into a frenzy because it was very rare to see an elf in the city. And now one was being sold as a slave at an auction. Not only was she beautiful, but the merchant also presented that she was skilled in archery, could use magic, and could even read and write in the elven language. Whether the buyer was a noble, a wealthy merchant, or a hero, the chance to encounter an elf like this was extremely rare. The merchant opened the bidding at 20 million rubes, and Harold was stunned to see people scrambling to place bids with numbers he had never possessed in his entire life. In the end, the auction closed with a price of 633 million rubes, the winner being an ugly man in armor. Harold was astonished by the amount of money the bidders were willing to spend just to buy a slave. He realized that no matter how beautiful and rare this elf was, these bidders were on a completely different level of wealth. The auction continued, and after hearing the huge numbers being called out, Harold started to feel dizzy. Then, the merchant announced that the final slave of the night was a dark elf. The reaction from the bidders clearly showed they wanted nothing to do with her. As buying a dark elf could mean bringing danger upon oneself, the merchant was surprised when no one placed a bid for this dark elf. Meanwhile, Harold noted that this was a completely different situation compared to the regular elf, though he could understand the bidders' reactions, as society rumored that dark elves brought misfortune to all who came into contact with them. This idea was deeply ingrained in popular belief through fairy tales and lessons taught to children. In fact, there was a famous story about a dark elf who came to sow trouble and bad luck for naughty children. Dark elves were even rarer than regular elves, so Harold believed that most of the people there didn't even know what they were really like. There was even a rumor about a family that once got involved with a dark elf, after which they went bankrupt and were eventually killed in despair. In an attempt to generate interest, the merchant began to present that this dark elf was only 15 years old, had extensive knowledge of magic, and had explored the labyrinth a few times. He also emphasized that she could serve as a bodyguard or a companion on quests, and was especially good at housework. The merchant also emphasized that she was still a virgin, and that the highest bidder would have the privilege of being her first. In this country, the elf race is considered filthy and wicked, but in other places, there are even regions where dark elves are known as virgins who bring good fortune. Harold now understood why they had saved her for the finale. They thought everyone would go wild for her, but since they were from another continent, they had underestimated the deep-seated prejudice the residents of the Northeast held against dark elves. The merchant realized this was about to be a failed auction for the dark elf, so he decided to start the bidding for her at 150,000 rubes. Harold was surprised to find that he hadn't walked out of the auction yet. Perhaps it was due to the merchant's pride. But even at the starting price, not a single person stood up to bid. However, this amount was just right for Harold, so after a few seconds of thought, he raised his hand, indicating that he would buy the dark elf for 150,000 rubes. The other bidders were astonished to see someone willing to buy a dark elf, who were rumored to bring misfortune. To be honest, Harold had never intended to spend anything, but by sheer coincidence, the asking price was the exact amount of money he had on him. In any case, Harold had no prejudice against dark elves and wasn't one to believe nasty rumors about people he'd never met. And besides, even if the rumors were true, his life was already so miserable he had nothing left to lose. After Harold made his bid, no one else competed, so the dark elf was sold to him for that price. A short while later, after the auction had ended, the merchant informed Harold that he'd gotten a fantastic deal. On the Western continent, he had sold dark elves for the equivalent of 1.6 billion rubes. Harold was so shocked he immediately spat out his drink and asked the merchant if he was going to cancel the transaction. The merchant replied that he would not. He explained that trust is crucial in business, and if people always doubted whether he would back out of a deal, he wouldn't have been able to stay in business. After that, it was time for the slave to be handed over. Harold was instructed to place a drop of his blood onto the collar and have her put it on. Harold looked confused, so the merchant explained that this was necessary for the collar to recognize him as her master. This was a subjugation collar, designed to shoot out sharp spikes if the wearer tried to kill their master, the one whose blood it had accepted. The merchant also stressed that no one could remove the collar except for her master. Without hesitation, Harold slowly. After he finished, it occurred to Harold that he'd never asked for her name. The girl then introduced herself as Atai. After this introduction, they looked at each other for a moment. Harold then asked her if something was wrong. She immediately got flustered and thanked him, because from what she just observed, it seemed her master was a good person. Although he'd lost everything when his house burned down, Harold now had a beautiful, dark elf female slave. A short while later, Harold and Ati were walking through the town square. Suddenly, Ati saw a regular elf pass by and immediately became uncomfortable. Harold noticed this and quickly asked what was wrong. She explained that dark elves don't get along well with regular elves. Harold understood this wasn't a personal issue between them, but rather a matter of her race. Even so, Harold started thinking about his next move. He thought it would be great if they could go home, but then he was painfully reminded that he no longer had a home to return to. A moment later, Harold explained to Ati that they couldn't go back to his house since it had burned down, and they couldn't stay at an inn either, because he'd spent all his remaining money to buy her. However, he reassured her not to worry because he had a plan. There was an unused hut at the foot of the mountain, so he figured it would be a suitable place for them to spend the night, and Ati agreed. Harold looked at Ati's outfit and realized she was dressed very simply. He thought he needed to buy her some new clothes, but since he was completely broke at the moment, he couldn't do it right away. Still, he promised he would do something about it for her soon. Harold found it strange that just a few hours ago, he had felt depressed and wanted to give up after losing his home. But now he was starting to get back on his feet. Then, he told Ati to let him know if she needed anything else. Ati replied that she might need some weapons and armor. Hearing this, Harold was very surprised and wondered why she would need such things. Ati, considering that Harold was short on money, suggested that they could go into the dungeon together. She then said that even without going too deep into it, they could still make some money. Ati had experience with dungeons before. However, she might need a little time to get used to a new one, but that didn't mean they wouldn't be able to earn anything at all. When Harold heard this, he recalled the slave trader's words that Ati had considerable knowledge of magic and had also explored a few dungeons. Ati continued, saying that since dark elves were clearly not well liked in the city, she figured it might be difficult to find a normal job. To prove her strength, Ati threw a stone into the air with great force. At first, Harold didn't understand the purpose of this action, but a few seconds later, a bird fell dead to the ground. Ati looked a little embarrassed and said that she'd only managed to kill one bird, and if she had a bow or a gun, she could have shot down 3 at once. After that, Harold started to think about how, in addition to her combat skills, Ati also had considerable knowledge of magic. This made him think that the two of them could actually make a good living exploring dungeons. Before long, Harold suggested they should start preparing as soon as possible, but he also reminded Ati that no matter how confident she was, the dungeon was still a very dangerous place. He told her that if she ever felt it wasn't right, she could turn back at any time, because the most important thing was for them to return safely. Ati replied that she would definitely be careful, and that she didn't want to die either. She added that she would do everything she could to protect Harold, with a radiant smile on her face. This made Harold blush as he realized it was the first time he'd ever seen her smile. A moment later, he remembered her saying she would try to protect him, and silently hoped that this didn't mean he had to go into the dungeon with her too. A few hours later, they arrived at the cabin Harold had mentioned earlier. For an unused place, Ati was surprised to see the cabin was quite decent. He then explained to her that he used to stop by this place to do repairs, and that it was very convenient for when he went gathering wild plants and herbs. Ati then offered to take care of preparing their meal, and after she was done, Harold noticed she was exhausted and lying on the bed, curled up like a child. Harold approached her, but she immediately sensed his presence and woke up. He reassured her not to worry, that she could sleep comfortably because he wouldn't do anything strange while she was sleeping. After a few minutes, Harold realized Ati had fallen asleep again, but he wondered if she was only pretending, fearing he might attack her since she was a slave. Harold figured she was probably aware of what could happen, but that didn't make the situation any less terrifying. A short while later, the sound of heavy booming footsteps was so loud it woke Ati from her sleep. Harold stepped outside and saw a troop of Imperial Knights on the march. He was confused as to why they were heading east. Harold didn't really have a grasp on the continent's political situation, but the sight made him wonder if a major conflict was on the horizon. Shortly after, Attie admitted she felt a little anxious about the situation. Harold suggested they should leave and head to another continent. She worriedly asked how he would get enough money for the trip since Harold was completely broke. Harold confidently said he would earn enough for their journey. He asked Attie if there was anywhere specific she wanted to go, and she replied that she wanted to go to the southwestern corner of the southern continent. Harold immediately agreed that would be their next destination. However, Harold suddenly remembered that the southern continent was notoriously expensive. Even boarding a ship cost a fortune, but since Attie would be earning money in the labyrinth, he figured it made more sense for him to join her. The only problem was that he only knew how to use a spear, a skill his father had taught him. Attie wondered why Harold didn't ask her reason for wanting to go there, and he replied that now that she mentioned it, he was starting to get curious. Meanwhile, despite his desperation, Harold had just lost his job and needed to earn some money to enter the labyrinth and make a living. He would have to ask his old boss to take him back and hope he wouldn't get an earful. When he arrived at the shop, it only took one look for Harold to think his boss was definitely furious. But contrary to his expectations, his boss was overjoyed at Harold's return. He even added that after Harold hadn't shown up for a while, he got curious and went to his house to check on him. When he got there, he saw Harold's house had been burned to the ground and even thought Harold had died in the fire. In short, Harold's boss was simply relieved that he was still alive. Harold then sat down and explained his current situation. After a brief chat, his boss understood that Harold needed to get some money together to enter the labyrinth. However, he was still curious why Harold wanted to go to the southern continent. Harold didn't want to share the details and just said he needed to get there urgently. Harold's boss understood and told him to wait a moment while he went to get something. A few minutes later, he returned with an envelope full of cash and explained that he had originally intended to give this money to Harold when he struck out on his own. As there's a saying that a master often gives a gift to his apprentice when sending them off with goodwill. But Harold reminded him that he'd never received any goodwill from his boss. Though he knew this was true, Harold's boss said he had been saving this money, originally planning to give it to Harold. And since he would be leaving soon, he thought now was a good time to hand it over. He also admitted that Harold had worked very hard for the past 15 years, and although he didn't think the amount was much, he said Harold should consider it his retirement pay. Upon hearing this, Harold was incredibly grateful and thanked his boss for everything he had done for him over the years. A few hours later, Harold returned to the abandoned cabin after a hunting trip, where he was immediately greeted by Attie, who had prepared him a feast fit for a king. Harold thanked Attie for the meal and then announced that he had some money now, so they would be going into town to buy some gear. He gave her a wide-brimmed white hat, intending for it to hide her long ears, which were the subject of much prejudice. Harold noticed Attie was silent after receiving the gift, so he asked if she would prefer a different kind of hat. Attie reassured him that she was perfectly happy with this one. The next day, they went to a weapon shop, where Harold asked Attie what kind of weapon she felt most comfortable using. She replied that it was a difficult choice because every weapon has its own pros and cons. After careful consideration, she decided on a sniper rifle. The shopkeeper then announced that the rifle cost 50,000 rubes. Hearing the price, Harold asked if she wanted him to buy her a more expensive one, but she replied that this rifle was perfectly fine for her. However, Attie went on, saying that what she really wanted was a single-shot rifle. If she could get a special bow like the famous demon bow, its power would far surpass that of a regular gun. However, the demon bow cost around 6.8 million rubes, and she knew Harold couldn't afford such a large sum. The advantage of the gun was that, while not expensive, it still had decent destructive power and penetration. Guns still need ammunition, of course, but it would be economical as long as she didn't waste shots. The downsides of a gun were its loud noise and being harder to aim than a bow, but you could still attach parts to reduce the noise. Aiming wasn't a big issue for Attie either. At this point, Harold noticed Attie was talking more than usual. She clearly had a passion for bows and guns. When talking about things she loved, she became quite chatty. A moment later, Harold said he would buy the rifle along with a suppressor for Ati, which made her very happy. With their purchase made, Ati was now ready for battle in the labyrinth, and as her master, she realized Harold also needed some gear for himself. However, Harold replied that he was perfectly fine with the bare minimum and also thought it was best to equip the most experienced person first. He then mentioned he would buy his own gear when he had enough money, which Ati understood. Harold thought for a moment and realized just how poorly equipped he was. Just a single glance was enough to see that his short spear was of very poor quality. But the cheapness of the weapon didn't matter to him. What mattered was its effectiveness. He considered his spear a one-time use weapon, because if he used even half his strength, it would definitely break. With their preparations complete and no more obstacles in their way, they decided to head towards their main objective, which was to make money in the labyrinth. Harold briefly explained its history. The labyrinth was established mainly because managing the proliferation of monsters was linked to the peace of the region. It accepted many types of people to explore it, which was the main reason hunters were allowed to keep monster materials from inside. The purpose of this was to prevent the labyrinth from being overrun with monsters. After hearing all this, Harold had a better understanding of the labyrinth and found himself wishing his father had told him more about it when he was a child. But all his father ever told him was that he didn't have much talent, which made Harold think he was hopeless when it came to the labyrinth or anything related to combat. Apparently, Harold's late father had been a professional labyrinth hunter. Harold knew that his father was highly respected in his field and was also very skilled. But one day, 15 years ago, he entered the labyrinth and never came back. The fact that he never returned led Harold to believe his father was dead. His father's goal had been to find the labyrinth's final location, which lay deep beneath the lowest floor. This wasn't a wise decision, considering he went in with only a spear, which isn't very effective in tight spaces. Harold lost his mother to illness when he was a child, and after his father disappeared, he became an orphan and had to fend for himself. This experience made Harold cautious, and he warned Ati that even though she was very confident in her abilities, the labyrinth was still extremely dangerous. He reminded her that if she encountered a life-threatening situation, she should retreat immediately. The next day, Harold and Ati arrived at the labyrinth and noticed that many adventurers were gathered there. As they approached the labyrinth's gate, they were stopped by a man in armor. Judging by the way he was dressed, Harold easily guessed that he was the guard in charge of the labyrinth. After a moment, Harold asked the guard if there was any entrance fee. The guard replied that it cost nothing to enter the labyrinth. But at the same time, he mentioned a problem he had been warning adventurers about. Harold and Ati looked confused, so the guard explained that recently there had been reports of a few monsters from the deeper floors appearing on the upper levels. Although the knights had formed a search party, it yielded no results. And since no one had witnessed the monsters for a while, the search had been suspended. At the end of his explanation, the guard warned that it was possible those monsters were still lurking in the labyrinth. So he urged them both to be extremely careful. Harold then asked Ati what she thought about this. She replied that it wasn't impossible for a few monsters from the lower floors to appear, but there were also many cases of false reports, so it was hard to be certain. But since there was still a possibility of monsters appearing, Ati thought they should both be cautious and stay vigilant. As they continued deeper into the labyrinth, they happened to encounter another group of adventurers. The leader of this group took one look at Harold and remarked that entering the labyrinth with such shoddy equipment was nothing short of suicide. He even sneered at Harold's old spear. The group leader sarcastically mused that Harold probably admired Edwin Smith, a legendary labyrinth conqueror. As soon as he heard that name, Harold immediately realized it was his father's. However, Harold had never thought that his father was a labyrinth conqueror and a legendary hero. Meanwhile, the leader saw Ati and said that she looked quite pretty, and on top of that, was completely stacked. He tried to touch her, but Harold reacted instantly, telling him to back off while pointing the tip of his spear directly at the man's throat. Maintaining his strong fighting stance, Harold declared that the guy was not to look at or touch his woman again, or it would be the end of him. After this confrontation, the remaining adventurers were stunned by Harold's strength and agility, even though they had thought he looked weak and small. Harold, however, found it strange that they were so surprised, as they should have noticed this sooner. In the tense atmosphere, the leader, with beads of sweat on his face, asked Harold to relax and said that he was just joking. Meanwhile, Harold turned to look at Ati and noticed she had a rather strange expression. He hoped she wasn't angry with him. Right after that, Harold lowered his spear and said he didn't have time to deal with pathetic lowlifes like them, then suggested they get going. After Harold left, the group of adventurers was still in shock from his lightning-fast attack. They had seen Harold as a rookie, but from the way he struck, they all knew very well not to mess with him if they didn't want trouble. A few minutes later, Harold and Ati reached the labyrinth, where they observed the glowing walls and floors, which was known as Labyrinth Light. Just then, with a blushing face, Ati thanked Harold for standing up for her against those cowardly adventurers. She whispered that she was very surprised when Harold called her his woman, adding that she had always had a strong desire to be with him. Harold didn't quite hear what she said because she was whispering, but he simply replied that he was glad she was happy. While the two were still standing at the edge of the cave, Ati knelt on one knee and fired a shot from her sniper rifle, aiming deep into a dark corner of the cave. Ati didn't believe she would hit anything, but to her surprise, she cleanly shot a monster lizard. Harold was incredibly surprised since he couldn't even see anything in that darkness. Ati then said that it was just a small monster, and she explained that since birth, she had always had very good eyes and ears. Hearing this, Harold realized that he had always thought Ati was very talented, but her skills and abilities far exceeded his expectations. Harold then asked Ati if they could go deeper into the labyrinth, and she replied that she had only ever gone as deep as the middle floors, but couldn't go any further alone. Harold immediately understood that this meant she used to have companions in the past, and Ati confirmed it. She continued to explain that when she was on the Western continent, she had joined an all-female labyrinth exploration party, where she stayed for a while. But before she could continue her story, Harold noticed she was hesitating, so he reassured her that she didn't have to tell him if she didn't want to. Ati then replied that it was a very kind thought from him, but she thought this was a good opportunity to tell Harold about her past. She began to briefly explain what had happened. Apparently, the leader of the party had fallen in love with a man, and she'd given him a large portion of the group's profits. One day, Ati was drugged, and when she woke up, she discovered she'd been sold to a slave trader. Ati wasn't entirely sure, but she suspected that her own leader had sold her, since being a virgin female dark elf was rare and could fetch a high price. After hearing this story, Harold felt sympathy for Ati and said her leader was a terrible person for doing that. However, Ati saw a silver lining in all of this. She reasoned that if her leader hadn't fallen for that man and sold her, she wouldn't have been able to become the slave of someone as good as Harold. She also said that if she had been sold to a cruel person, she would definitely resent her leader a great deal. Harold, despite not thinking he had done anything particularly special as a master, was incredibly surprised to hear her say that. However, from Ati's words, Harold made a promise to himself that he would do his best to be a good master to her. At the same time, he realized that he now understood her feelings better. Meanwhile, Ati was lost in thought and realized that she had truly fallen in love with Harold. At this point, she would probably do anything for him, just as her former leader once did. A few minutes later, Ati continued using her sniper rifle to take out a few more cave rats, model. Then Harold would process the fur. After repeating this several times, Harold suggested they should head back home. On their way back, they saw a giant door up ahead, and both assumed there might be treasure inside. Harold, being the curious one, proposed that they stop to check what was behind the door. Before entering, Ati used her magic to create a few butterflies. Harold was surprised to see she could do that, and then noticed that some of the butterflies seemed to stop at random points, which confused him. Addie explained that these were magical butterflies she created. They are drawn to places where they can sense malice, which is why some of them stopped at certain spots. Those are the trapped areas. Addie also added that she had many other spells, but none of them could be used directly in combat. Just then, one of her butterflies landed right in front of them, indicating that there were still a few traps ahead. But on the bright side, there was probably some treasure left. Addie explained to Harold that no one had ever passed through the area they were in, but since there were many adventurers on the upper floors, it was likely that this treasure had appeared recently. Harold didn't quite understand what she meant by appeared recently. So Addie further explained that it's rumored the dungeon has a will of its own. After a treasure is taken, the dungeon will partially collapse after a certain number of days, and over time, it will move the treasure to a different location, resetting the traps as well. After Harold heard and understood this, he added that there were rumors the dungeon also creates monsters. A few minutes later, they reached a room where they saw a very beautiful dagger in the center. However, Addie's danger-sensing butterflies landed on it. So she assumed the dagger was likely cursed, something very rare on the upper floors of the dungeon. Harold didn't know much about the dungeon, so he wanted Atia's opinion on what to do next. She replied that if the curse only had negative effects, they couldn't use the dagger themselves, and no one would buy it, even if they tried to sell it. However, they could try to identify the type of curse in the area using spells or magic, or alternatively, by using special magic tools. Harold decided to leave it for now, and wait until they had the necessary tools to identify the curse. A few seconds later, Harold asked if these magic tools were expensive. Addie replied that they were indeed very expensive, costing as much as a whole house. Hearing this, Harold could hardly believe it, as he knew it had taken 15 years of saving to build his old house. Addie continued, saying that if they could earn a steady income from the lower floors of the dungeon, they'd be able to make enough for the magic tools in about a month. And if they were lucky, they could earn that amount in a single expedition. However, Harold told Atia that if they ended up not being able to afford the magic tools, she shouldn't worry about it anymore and should just relax and earn money safely, since their goal was only to make money for their journey. Ati smiled and agreed with him. As they continued through the dungeon, they came across a large crowd and decided to see what was going on. Harold looked into the center of the crowd and realized the man there was the one who had won the elf slave auction. He was the third son of a count. The crowd confirmed that the rumors about him bragging while exploring the dungeon were true. Right now, he was boasting about the new elf slave he had just bought. Harold felt annoyed seeing her being treated so poorly. He wondered why the elf girl didn't do anything to fight back. Ati explained that the slave collar wouldn't allow the elf to harm her master in any way. The man considered the elf slave a great achievement because she was beautiful, could use magic, and was not only useful in the dungeon, but could also entertain him in the bedroom. Seeing the look on Adi's face, Harold knew she felt great pity for the other elf. He told Adi she didn't have to look if it was upsetting her. After a moment, Harold suggested they should get going. A few hours later, they had left the crowd and continued on their journey. They arrived at the Nepal Trading Company, where Harold told Ati that when he worked for his master, the silversmith, he often did business with this company. It was famous for buying any and all materials you could gather from the dungeon. Once inside, Harold was greeted by a man named Tosu. From the way they spoke, it was clear that the two were very familiar with each other. Harold then told Tosu that he wanted to sell a beast pelt he had acquired from the dungeon. Tosu was surprised and said he was shocked that Harold had switched from being a silversmith to a dungeon explorer. Harold explained that he needed money to travel to the southern continent. Seeing the urgency of the situation, Tosu decided not to ask too many questions to avoid wasting time. Tosu inspected it and said that the beast pelt Harold brought in was the fur of a migranti, valued at 15,000 rubes per piece, for a total of 12,000 rubes. Harold was very surprised by this amount, knowing that his daily wage at his master's place was only about 7,000 rubes. This income from exploring the dungeon was nearly double that. Harold realized he would be able to save up a lot more money sooner than he expected. He then asked Tosu about the cost to get to the southern continent, and Tosu replied that it would cost about 3 million rubes for both of them to travel via the western continent. And if they wanted to go directly to the southern continent, it would cost about 10 million rubes for the two of them. The reason the direct route to the southern continent was so expensive was because it passed through an isolated area where monsters from an undersea dungeon were active. However, going via the western continent would be cheaper and safer. Harold always prioritized safety, so he decided they would take the route through the western continent. He also figured that if they could earn about 2 million more rubes, they would be fine. The initial cost was estimated at about 5 million rubes, so Harold now had a clear idea of what they needed. The two of them then continued killing monsters in the dungeon. And a week later, after returning to the trading post, they realized they had earned over 170,000 rubes in just that week. After deducting their living expenses, they had 120,000 rubes left. Harold then said he wanted to start hunting monsters on the middle floors soon, to which Ati agreed. Therefore, he declared that the next day, they would start exploring the middle floors. However, at that moment, he had no idea what they were about to face. The next day, they finally entered the middle floors, and Harold felt anxious about all the monsters they would encounter. At first, Ati was leading the way, but she suddenly stopped, prompting Harold to immediately ask what was wrong. She replied that she didn't like the atmosphere in that cave. Harold was a bit confused as to why she felt that way, and almost started to assume they might be lost. Ati replied that wasn't it, but she had sensed something very large approaching. Just then, they both heard a loud noise, and Ati immediately suggested they run and find a place to hide. A few moments later, Harold was stunned to see a giant monster emerge from a narrow hole in the cave. At the same time, Ati was also terrified but tried to stay calm. Looking at the monster's nature, Ati could tell it was a dangerous earth dragon from the lower levels. Harold was surprised to hear that an earth dragon was on a lower floor. Right then, Ati apologized to Harold, saying she couldn't even scratch the monster with a normal bullet, which showed just how tough its skin was. And Harold, not wanting to risk death, suggested to Ati that they should just head home. But just as they were about to leave, they both heard a voice crying for help. At the same time, the voice was rapidly approaching them. A moment later, the owner of that panicked voice turned out to be the man they had seen earlier, the one who had mistreated his elf slave. Ignoring that, he ran towards them, shouting that a high-level monster had appeared and he needed help. When he reached Atiye and Harold, he immediately fell to his knees and explained that he was part of a 4-person group. When his comrades saw the dragon, they hid in a narrow crevice, but after a while, the monster discovered them. Right now, the dragon is still waiting outside for his comrades to leave their hiding spot. After hearing his story, Harold started to remember meeting this man somewhere before. Just a few seconds later, his 2 brain cells fired up, and Harold realized this was the same guy who had threatened 80. Harold thought that it was too late to go back and call for help, and he wasn't even sure if anyone was strong enough to defeat that monster dragon. After weighing the situation, Harold realized it was completely absurd to go fight that monster alone. But just as he was about to refuse the plea, the man started crying again, saying that some of his comrades had children, and if they died, their kids' lives would become miserable. This reminded Harold of how his own father had entered the labyrinth and never returned. Harold realized that if he refused to help, those men's children would face the same miserable fate he had. He clenched his fists, his eyes serious, and then asked the man where his comrades were hiding. This implicitly showed that Harold had decided to help. Right after, Adi asked about the current situation. Harold took a deep breath and explained that he'd heard there were children at risk of losing their fathers, and he couldn't just stand by without doing his best to help in the situation. Adi suggested Harold use her secret weapon, but before she could finish her sentence, Harold transformed into a superhuman for a few seconds and rushed off to rescue the adventurers. Feeling uneasy, Adi yelled his name to stop him, but it was no use. Harold ran for a while until he reached the buried wall where the dragon was waiting. He saw the four men hiding in a hole opposite the monster, while the dragon just sat there, waiting for them to come out. Harold thought that since there was only one monster, defeating it would be easy. He could sense the dragon's complacency and arrogance, which was probably why it hadn't noticed him. Because of that, Harold believed he could win. He prepared to attack, tensing every nerve and muscle. As he was gathering an enormous amount of energy from another dimension, this powerful energy tore at every inch of his flesh. He channeled all of this power into his short spear and attacked the monster. However, the power he was using wasn't magic, but a violent torrent of energy, something that shouldn't be manifested in this world. And in particular, the price for using this power was extremely high. Meanwhile, after Harold had defeated the monster with his mysterious power, he was lying face down on the ground. A moment later, Adi rushed over to him. She immediately touched him to check his condition. Harold opened his eyes, unsure of where he was, but replied that he was fine, just a little dizzy. Even so, he added that he didn't think there would be any serious after effects from the battle. Ati was very worried about his health, especially after seeing him collapse with blood on his face. She made Harold promise her he would be more careful in similar situations next time, and he agreed with a smile on his face. Afterward, the adventurers whose lives Harold had saved came to thank him for risking his life to save them. They saw him as their savior, because in that moment, they had believed they would never see their children again and thought they were going to die. Harold could feel their sincerity and humbly accepted their thanks. After defeating the monster, Harold wanted to take a part of its body back to sell, but he knew that dissecting the dragon's corpse would be very difficult, especially since its skin was so tough. After Harold said this, A.T. remarked that the earth dragon was an extremely powerful monster, and its outer skin was made of dragon metal. Even though dismantling the monster's corpse was difficult, she still wondered how someone as small and useless as Harold could have made a hole in the earth dragon's body. Harold then explained to Ati that he had used a special skill called Scorching Piercing Lance, but he always lost consciousness whenever he used it, so he couldn't use it often. Ati remembered the terrifying moment she saw Harold unconscious, so she begged him not to use that skill anymore. Harold replied that he would do his best not to use it. Not long after, the adventurers Harold had saved offered to help him carry the monster's corpse back. They felt they owed him their lives, so it was the least they could do to repay him. Harold accepted their offer with a smile. Meanwhile, Harold wondered how much a deep floor monster would be worth. A few hours later, he arrived at the trading shop, where the receptionist informed him that the materials he brought back were worth up to 13 million rubes. The moment he heard that amount, Harold nearly had a heart attack, cold sweat running down his face. He realized why the labyrinth attracted so many people. The receptionist then informed him that since the amount Harold was receiving exceeded 10 million rubes, he needed to fill out his banking information. As he did so, Harold thought that it had been a long time since he'd used that fighting technique, and it had taken a toll on his body. But in the end, the pain and injuries were worth it. 2 days later, Harold was stunned to see that 13 million rubes had actually been deposited into his account. He still couldn't believe it, but he quickly realized that he and Ati now had enough money to travel to the Western continent. After successfully withdrawing the money, he returned to the tent, bringing back a peach pie that Ati had been craving. He said he bought it as a gift for Ati, since he had asked her to stay home. Ati thanked Harold and immediately took a bite of the peach pie. She remarked on how delicious it was. Afterward, Harold announced that they had saved enough money and they would set off for the port city the next day. The next day, they reached the edge of town, where they were shown the carriage that would take them to the port city. From there, they would take a ship to the southern continent as they both boarded the carriage and began their journey. Harold, having fought his way from losing his home in a fire to taking down an earth dragon, admitted to himself that he never expected to find himself in such situations. He realized he was lost in his own thoughts and didn't want Atai to know he was worried. He quickly asked Atie if she had ever been to the Western continent. Atie replied that she didn't think it was a bad place, and although there were many different races, which often led to conflict, that very diversity gave it a unique charm. Harold then told her he needed her help to guide him around the southern continent, as she was familiar with the area. This filled Ati with joy, as she felt genuinely needed by Harold. Just then, a beautiful girl with a sword and her grandfather appeared, both patiently waiting for the carriage that would take them to the port. After a short wait, they saw the Cat 1 carriage that would take them to their destination, and somehow, it was the very same one Harold and Ati had boarded. Stepping inside, Harold was surprised to see two strangers in the carriage. The girl's grandfather immediately asked Harold who he was, and then began to closely observe his facial features and behavior, suspecting Harold might be the son of someone he once knew. Instantly, his granddaughter slapped him across the face to punish him for his rude behavior towards a stranger he had never met before. She then introduced her grandfather to Harold as Varen Myers and introduced herself as Cecil. Then Varen mentioned his father's name, Gurgo, and as soon as Harold heard it, the name sounded very familiar, making him wonder where he had heard it before. Before Varen could say anything more, Cecil told him to be quiet, then bowed her head and apologized to Harold for her grandfather's rude behavior. Varen understood that his previous behavior had greatly embarrassed Cecil, so he also apologized to Harold. Right after, Varen mentioned that he and Cecil were on their way to the Western continent, and Harold replied that he was also heading in that direction. They acknowledged that they would be traveling companions for a short while, and the atmosphere turned cheerful, as it was clear they were looking forward to their time together. A few hours later, they arrived at the port city, where the two pairs of companions said their goodbyes. As they parted, Cecil mentioned that she and her grandfather would be boarding a ship called the Balestia, and if Harold and Ati hadn't decided on a ship yet, they might consider taking it. They then waved goodbye to each other. Harold then suggested that they should find a good ship to take them to their destination, adding that it would be better to find one that wasn't too expensive. A few minutes later, they arrived at the docks, where they were greeted by a bald merchant with an eye patch. This man informed Harold that there were many ships currently docked, so he had a good chance of finding a decent one. Harold understood this and asked the merchant about the ship named Balestia. The merchant replied that it was just an ordinary ship, nothing special. For Harold and Ati, the fare would be 2.8 million rubes, which included a small bedroom and 2 meals. However, the merchant noticed Harold was a thrifty person, so he informed him that it was possible to pay 200,000 rubes per person. But that would mean they would have to stay in a large room shared with about a dozen other people and would only be provided 1 meal. That room, however, would be very messy and filled with disease-ridden rodents. Moreover, the ship sometimes even sinks and has to be rescued. The merchant also informed them that the ships wouldn't be leaving for another week, so Harold and Ati could still come back once they had decided which ship to take. As the two walked, Harold considered that a luxury ship would cost up to 10 million rubes, and he also knew that if they searched for a fast ship, they would surely be disappointed with the food and living conditions on board. Harold decided that it would take a few days to think more carefully about choosing a ship, while also thinking it would be a good idea for them to find a place to stay and eat in the meantime. As the two were walking along the road, a stranger suddenly ran past them. Just a few seconds later, Harold realized his bag, containing their entire fortune of about 10 million rubes, had been stolen. But just then, a bullet hit the young thief in the leg, causing him to stumble to the ground. Harold immediately grabbed the kid by the collar, demanding his money bag back. It was at that moment Harold realized the bullet that had just hit the ground was from Adi's gun. To Harold's surprise, Adi said she only fired a warning shot and had no intention of harming anyone. But the kid still stole Harold's money. And even if he's a child, some things are just unacceptable. While Ati was scolding the boy, Harold noticed he had an unpleasant smell and was wearing tattered clothes. This led him to ask the obvious question: did the boy need the money? Ati, however, disagreed with giving the boy money after he had just tried to rob Harold. She continued to scold the boy even more harshly. Just then, a woman called out the boy's name, Matsudo, and asked what he thought he was doing. As it turned out, this was Matsudo's mother. And she rushed to apologize to Harold for her son's foolish actions, promising to scold him when they got home. But Harold reassured her that he had gotten his money back, so there was no need to punish the boy further. He also advised her to teach Matsudo proper moral lessons, so he wouldn't need to be fixed later. Matsudo's mother sighed and said that she always tried to teach him what was right, but he never listened. In an angry voice, Matsudo told his mother to be quiet and explained that he was stealing to earn money to help his father and pay off the family's debts. Having said that, the boy immediately took off like the wind, forcing his mother to hurriedly chase after him. After they were long gone, Harold and Ati realized that Matsudo's mother must have a lot on her plate, especially having to deal with such a mischievous child. However, this was a story that happens everywhere, so neither Harold nor Ati was too surprised. Afterward, Harold decided they needed to find a comfortable place to rest. Finally, they arrived at an inn and asked about vacant rooms. The receptionist replied that there were no more rooms for that day. They left and tried many other inns, but their efforts were unsuccessful. They had tried more than a dozen inns, but couldn't believe that there were no rooms left. When they had almost lost hope, they decided to try one more inn. This time, surprisingly, they had a vacant room, but it was just a small room with a double bed, which might be enough for 2 people. However, when they were led to the room, they were shocked because the room was so small. What was more surprising was that the receptionist had lied about there being a double bed. Harold started to wonder whether he should sleep on the floor or in the bathroom. He then said he wanted to take a bath, which surprised Ati, as he wasn't dirty at all and looked even cleaner than usual. But she just assumed he had been sweating without realizing it. Ati suddenly said that she also wanted to take a bath, because such a small room could make smells spread more easily, and she didn't want to fill the room with the smell of her fish oil. After saying that, Ati rushed into the bathroom. After they'd both finished bathing, Harold was seen walking down the hallway, and he happened to overhear a conversation between 2 gentlemen. One said that he'd been on the northeast continent and was about to go to a city called Tawakkul. He was traveling with his son and said they would arrive in Tawakkul in about 1 to 2 months. He also recalled that the last time he was there was more than 10 years ago, and the city was truly beautiful. His son was overjoyed to hear this and was very much looking forward to the trip. But he was still a little worried. The boy added that since they left the ship, he had heard some strange rumors that the situation in the empire was starting to become unstable. And if a war were to break out, there would most likely be checkpoints on the roads. As soon as Harold heard this, he remembered the checkpoints he had witnessed earlier. He also heard that many others had seen the same thing, meaning he wasn't the only one who found it strange. Anyway, Harold wasn't too concerned about matters of war because he was about to leave the continent. When he returned to the room, he hopped onto his surprisingly comfortable bed. After relaxing in the bath, he realized how tired he was from the long journey, and so Harold realized there was no reason to sleep on the floor, and that there was nothing wrong with them sharing a bed, because it was just a bed for them both to sleep in. Soon after Adi returned from the bathroom, she noticed Harold was already in bed and immediately thought he was fast asleep. She moved closer and playfully whispered in his ear, asking if he was asleep yet. But instantly, Harold suddenly shot up and grabbed Ati's hand tightly, which surprised her. However, Adi seemed to be the type who liked it rough, so she leaned against his chest. Harold was surprised that she didn't resist at all, but he quickly understood that, as a slave, she might not want to resist even if she could. Her action made Harold wonder what she thought of him, but he decided it was better not to know. Adi was still in the mood and told Harold that she always knew this day would come. She also confessed that she had never traveled with anyone before, so she wanted him to make this trip memorable for her. She was aware that she was a slave, but at the same time, she was also a woman. If they were about to be intimate, this would be Ati's first time experiencing it, and Harold would be her first. Just as the atmosphere was getting as sensual as it could be, Harold suddenly spoke up, saying he just wanted to discuss which ship they should take. This completely stunned Ati, and her eyes went wide with surprise. Harold continued, saying they still had a week before the ship was set to depart, but if they waited too long, the tickets would be sold out. After careful consideration, he decided that the ship Balestia was the best option. To Harold, this was an ordinary ship, and the price was also suitable for his budget of 3 million rubes. It wasn't too cheap, nor was it too expensive. He considered it a moderate choice. Although Adi's face didn't look very happy, she still agreed with Harold's decision. A moment later, Harold announced that they would go buy tickets for the trip tomorrow. Throughout the conversation about the ship, Harold noticed that Ati seemed unhappy. He wondered if something was wrong. Before he could ask further, Harold noticed Ati had lain down on the bed in frustration, so he decided to lie down next to her, holding her in his arms. Harold thought that holding Ati so tightly was his right as her master, and as he held her tightly, Ati was flustered, her face blushing. She secretly thought that if Harold was willing to go this far, then he should have also finished the job of harvesting the field she had prepared. She had been really looking forward to this moment, so she felt deeply disappointed when things didn't go as expected. The next morning, the two returned to the blindfolded merchant they had met the day before and announced that they had decided to board the Balestia. Upon hearing this, the merchant informed them that the trip would cost 2.8 million rubes. After Harold paid, the merchant gave them the tickets and reminded them that the ship would depart in exactly 5 days, at noon. They were also told that they could now go to their room on the ship and sleep there. But they had to make sure not to miss the ship as there would be no refunds. After leaving the merchant's shop, they quickly headed for the dock. When they stood before the Balestia, they were both stunned by its impressive and beautiful appearance. They proceeded to the entrance, where an attendant asked to check their tickets before allowing them to board. Harold handed over the tickets, and the attendant remarked that they had gotten a fantastic room with a great view and a lot of space. After being allowed on board, Harold and Ati immediately went to their room. When Harold opened the door, they were both surprised by how comfortable and cool the room was. Ati saw a window with a beautiful view, just as the attendant had said. Their room was below sea level, which meant they could easily see everything swimming around. Harold noticed Ati was completely captivated by the window, so he decided not to disturb her, and he began to walk around the ship alone with his spear in hand. While walking, he ran into Cecil. She was happy to see that Harold had also decided to take this ship. Harold replied that he really couldn't find any other ship that seemed as good as this one from the start. Harold didn't see Cecil with her grandfather, so he asked about him. Cecil replied that he was sleeping. Suddenly, Cecil suggested that since they were both on the same ship, they should go walk around the city together for a while. Harold found this suggestion a bit strange, as being on the same ship and touring the city seemed completely unrelated. But before he could think it over, Cecil had already grabbed his hand and pulled him along for a walk. Later, they arrived in the city, and the two walked around and watched as Cecil enjoyed a snack. She noticed Harold wasn't eating anything, so she offered to share her portion and said he could have all of it. However, Harold politely declined. After a moment of silence, Cecil shared that her grandfather had taken a strong liking to Harold. Although Harold wasn't sure about it, he realized they had talked quite a bit back in the carriage. Cecil replied, saying it was because her grandfather had taken a liking to Harold that they chatted so much. Her grandfather was a friendly person, but he didn't usually talk much to people he disliked. The way he spoke with Harold made it clear he didn't hate him. Suddenly, Cecil launched a surprise attack on Harold, but he easily blocked it with his spear, leaving Cecil utterly astonished, her eyes wide with shock. She was surprised that Harold hadn't dodged but had instead parried, which meant he had seen and reacted to her attack in time. With a smile on his face, Harold thought Cecil's attack was a bit reckless, but he also acknowledged that her strength was truly impressive. Harold then asked Cecil why she had attacked him so randomly. With a smile, Cecil answered that since her grandfather had taken an interest in him, she felt it was necessary to test his strength. Hearing this, Harold could only wonder what other crazy things this girl was capable of for such a strange reason. Cecil noticed that Harold was quite surprised by her attack, so she quickly reassured him that she just wanted to test his skills. Nothing more. She even promised not to do something like that again. Afterward, Cecil suggested they both return to the ship. However, after what had just happened, Harold doubted whether that was a good idea. So he proposed that they should go their separate ways. Cecil chuckled lightly and told Harold he didn't need to be so guarded. Just then, they were drawn by the screams of a young boy, as two ugly thugs were trying to drag him away.